Okay, I think we can start. Participants started to join, and it's great to have you all around. I would like to welcome you to the webinar today, which is called, as you can see on the slide, the Climate Change Mitigation Potential of Forest Products. My name is Sven Walter. I'm Senior Forestry Officer at FAO, and I'm also the Secretary of the FAO Advisory Committee on Sustainable Forest-Based Industry, the ACSFI. And I'm based here in Rome at FAO headquarters. Today's event is organized by both the ACSFI and the FAO Forest Technical Network. The ACSFI consists of some 20 leading private sector experts from the forest products, forest industry, and pulp and paper associations. And they provide guidance to FAO on concepts, approaches, and initiatives in the field of the sustainable production and consumption of forest products. It also provides a forum of dialogue between FAO and the private sector to identify strategic actions that promote sustainable forest management. On the other side, we have the FAO Forest Technical Network, and that brings together FAO colleagues from headquarters, from the regional offices, sub-regional offices, and from our country representations. And they're all colleagues who are interested in forest-related matters. And so this platform provides an opportunity to share experience and to discuss issues at stake like today. So I would like to warmly welcome all our ACSFI members. I would like to welcome our FAO colleagues and of course all other participants who are joining today's webinar. The title and the topic is very exciting and interesting. So how do forest products support the mitigation of climate change? And the questions we're asking ourselves are, what is the potential role of forest products in mitigating the effects of climate change? And what are the most important roles that forest products could play also in the emerging circular bioeconomy and to achieve the sustainable development goals? We have an exciting panel to discuss above issues, and I would like to thank all panelists for the availability to participate in the meeting. I would like in particular thank my colleagues Ashley Steele, Lyndall Boll, and Francesca Bertola, who organized this webinar. Please note that the webinar is recorded and that the recording and all presentations will be made available on the FAO website. If you want to tweet the meeting, you may refer to hashtags such as ACSFI, climate change mitigation, or forest products. We will put this in the chat. Regarding the chat, please, if you have comments, questions, suggestions, kindly use the chat function. We will have time after the presentations to discuss your comments and questions with the panelists. I would like in particular welcome and thank Heidi Brock to be with us. She will be our moderator for the session. Heidi is the president and the CEO of the American Forest and Paper Association, and she is a member of the ACSFI based in Washington, DC. She will also introduce our excellent panelists. I guess, Heidi, you are in Washington and you had an exciting yesterday and an exciting night. And it's great to have you here today for this hopefully also exciting webinar. So please, I give you the floor to moderate this session. Over to you, Heidi.
Oh, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Sven. And yes, it has definitely been a short night for those of us in the United States. And I certainly agree that today's webinar is the perfect antidote for anyone who has been following the US elections. But seriously, I'm just so honored to be here today and to represent the American Forest and Paper Association in Washington, DC. We all know that paper and wood products are essential components of the modern world. And I really believe that our industry is responsible, innovative, sustainable, continuously making improvements to create a better planet and a bright future ahead. Today's discussion, we will be exploring how the forest products industry is leading the way to make a more sustainable future. And we have 3 leading researchers to join us from around the world. And in a moment, we will hear from each of them. But first, it's my great pleasure to welcome my colleague, Jose Carlos da Fonseca, Executive Director of the Brazilian Tree Industry, IBA, for his opening remarks. Jose Carlos joined IBA in 2019 as Executive Director, where he's responsible for institutional and public affairs at the local and global level. He is also IBA's representative at the International Council of Forest and Paper Associations, the Agribusiness Working Group of BRICS, and the International Chamber of Commerce. Jose Carlos has extensive experience in diplomacy. In addition to serving as a Brazilian ambassador in Asia, Africa, North America, and South America throughout his career, Jose Carlos also has a background in politics in both Brazil's legislative and executive branches. Jose Carlos, thank you so much for being here. Let me turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Heidi. You are a wonderful person to introduce me. I'm flattered just to listen to your description of my modest biography. Thank you so much. We are all following, by the way, events in the USA. They are of importance to all of us. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you to the ACSFI team for inviting IBA to be present here. And I'll be very brief in these opening remarks because we are looking forward to getting a good lesson, a good class from our panelists during this session. So I would like to present my compliments to the organizers, ACSFI and FDN, to Heidi, who's a wonderful colleague, and to Andrew from the UK, who will also be doing the closing remarks, and to greeting at the same time all the speakers and all the participants here with us. This is a very timely and important initiative, and it's part of a series of other events that FAO has been carrying out throughout this very difficult period of pandemic that we are all facing, but we have all been kept sharp and up to date thanks to these events and initiatives. Congratulations to you guys. Thank you, of course, for inviting IBA to be here. And just a brief word about us. The Brazilian tree industry is the entity, the institution responsible for representing the planted tree production chain in Brazil, from the fields to the factories, with all its main stakeholders, in order to add value to products derived from plantations of pine, eucalyptus, and other species planted for industrial purposes. IBA works to defend the interests of our sector in face of authorities and government agencies, other entities of our production chain, and significant stakeholders in the economy, in agendas like the environment and sustainability organizations, in the academic world, with consumers, the media, both in Brazil and internationally. We represent around 50 companies and 10 statewide forest entities in Brazil, for all dealing, of course, with products originating from planted trees, most notably wood panels, laminate flooring, pulp, paper, energy, forest, biomass, and an endless list of new bioelements and products that will be produced out of our trees, planted trees. IBA has been a part of ACSFI for more than a decade, as we recognize the importance of the role FAO plays, and ACSFI specifically, in order to coordinate and align dialogues and initiatives and actions towards a sustainable forest-based industry. This role has been increasing and getting more and more importance year after year, and the results, particularly from the current team, and thanks a lot to our chair, Karina, have been quite outstanding. So we are very proud to be part of this effort. FAO has been acting with a very results-oriented perspective throughout this year, and the COVID-19 pandemic has not thwarted its efforts to move on with a very important and exciting and necessary agenda. The topic chosen for today's seminar, climate change mitigation potential of forest products, is essential when it comes to climate change mitigation, sustainability, and the bioeconomy. Forests are at the core of all potential action plans for climate change, and our products are one of the most important players when you think of carbon storage. Just to illustrate the importance of products in climate change mitigation, I would make just a few illustrations here. Carbon stored in a wooden table can reach up to 47% of its weight. When you talk of a milk carton, can reach up to 45% of its weight. When we speak of laminate flooring, it's up to 47% of its weight. The carbon stored in charcoal from planted forests, for instance, can reach up to 85% of its weight. When you speak of a book, it can represent around 45% of its weight. So the service we provide is very important in this sense. The organizers of this seminar webinar have selected a very knowledgeable team of panelists and speakers to share their important knowledge, information, experience. So I'm very confident we'll have a most enjoyable and important class during this hour and a half ahead of us. We'll have presentations from the FAO team, from Costa Rica, from Finland, which means that we'll have an overall view, a panoramic view regarding this very important agenda. Although the time zone differences are a challenging problem for most of us, we are very confident that we'll have a fruitful conversation, and I wish all of us a very good seminar for speakers, participants, and to our moderators. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for that, Jose Carlos. I really appreciate your opening remarks there. What I'd like to do now is introduce Dr. Ashley Steele, who will provide us with an overview of forest products and the potential benefits of carbon storage in hardwood products. So Ashley joined FAO 2 years ago as a forest officer, focusing on statistics. But before joining the FAO, she served with the US federal government, serving both the US Forest Service and also at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. First, she served as a team leader for landscape ecology and recovery science, then as a lead statistician for the Pacific Northwest Research Station. Her previous work includes collaborations to understand the role of forest management across Alaska in carbon sequestration within forests, as well as guidance on best practices for incorporating modeled information into decision-making. Ashley is presenting a summary and implications from her background paper prepared for the ACSFI. And with that, I would now like to hand things over for her presentation to Dr. Ashley Steele. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much, Heidi. And thank you to the many participants for your enthusiasm to understand and to contribute, furthermore, to a better understanding overall of the climate change mitigation potential of forest products. So our shared future ambitions are really encapsulated in the SDGs, and carbon storage and harvested wood products has a relatively unique role among climate change mitigation opportunities because it has the potential to support an impressively wide and diverse set of sustainable development goals. So if we look first at a viable and sustainable forest product sector, that brings work and economic growth. That's an aspiration of SDG 8. The climate mitigation potential of these products can also allow a further reduction in the per dollar carbon intensity of global industries, SDG 9. Many of the jobs in the forest sector are importantly in rural areas, and still the sustainably sourced wood as a building material can contribute to sustainable cities and responsible consumption and production. So that's SDG 11 and 12. And if we look at SDG 13 on climate action, one recent estimate of the net sink of carbon in harvested wood products is between 26 and 139 million metric tons per year. So clearly a contribution to climate action. And finally, of course, quantifying the value of sustainably sourced forest products can incentivize the sustainable management of forests, SDG 15. So let's start at the very beginning. When a tree grows, and by the magic of photosynthesis, carbon is sequestered and stored in the tree. And then when that tree is harvested, the carbon in the tree is stored in the resulting forest product. It could be paper, pellets, sawnwood, cross-laminated timber. But when we use wood in that product, we also have to think about what building materials might be used for sustainable development that aren't wood. And alternative materials are generally more carbon intensive. So if we think about steel making, it produces 8% of the world's carbon emissions. Half of that goes into the buildings where wood's an emerging choice. And cement making produces 6% of the world's carbon emissions. So we want to put the picture back together. So in addition to direct storage, wood products can also be used in place of the products with a higher environmental cost, further contributing to climate mitigation. And production of forest products can lead to the generation of biofuels, which are not on this image, but which can also contribute to substitution for fuels with a higher environmental cost. There's general consensus that forest products have the potential to reduce carbon emissions and contribute to climate change mitigation. But there are a variety of pathways by which these benefits can be accrued and multiple types of analysis used to quantify each. One type of analysis which tries to encompass everything are life cycle analyses, or LCA, which you may be more familiar with that acronym. And that can include a range of different analysis types, and they follow the emission benefit. It could be the change in emission for a particular change in system operation, say a change in forest management, or for a particular product, say a wooden telephone pole. And these are complex analyses that generally involve multiple parts of the story. But for my presentation today, I'm going to try to untangle some of these various elements, and I'm going to focus mostly on the carbon stored in the wood. That's the gray area to the left, with one slide on substitution factors. And the other two speakers are going to focus on other elements of the story. It's important in the beginning to understand how intricately tied the parts are, and yet how particular types of work in quantifying these climate change mitigation benefits answer particular questions that are related but not identical. The question of carbon storage and exactly how much carbon is stored in wood and paper and other forest products is of particular relevance for carbon emissions reporting. And if we look at this steep graph, it describes the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it rose from 277 parts per million before the Industrial Revolution to over 400 parts per million. And in 2015, as you're well aware, countries came together and made commitments toward climate mitigation. So being able to quantify the carbon stored in the pool of harvested wood products is part of assessing how well countries are doing in meeting these commitments. And countries can make their calculation in a variety of ways. They need to be unbiased, they need to be transparent. And for countries without strong local data or analytical resources, estimates are often made from first-order decay equations. That's essentially describing a process in which a good deal of carbon disappears relatively quickly and some last for a very long time. And then it's also based on data describing the production of three general product categories: sawnwood, wood-based panels, and paperboard, often taken from FAO's Forest Products and Statistics database. And one last piece of this, what they're called simple calculations, are also default values where local values aren't available. These come from the IPCC, and there's two kinds: conversion factors that estimate how much carbon is in particular products, and half-lives, which describe in mathematical terms how much carbon is stored in the product, for example, in paper versus in sawnwood. So because FAO data are often used for these calculations, and it's of great importance, we've been working on a background paper to understand and synthesize and furthermore to communicate what's known about climate benefits from forest products. And again, the paper's focusing on the storage benefits, although invariably synthesizing results across studies means that we needed to also consider other parts of the story, such as substitution. So overall, we found that most studies across a fairly wide range of countries and products do report a climate benefit of harvested wood products. And two of the broader studies are quoted here. Pillay et al., looking at just mostly European countries, estimated sink of 12 million metric tons of carbon per year. That's from 1990 to 2012 in harvested wood products. And just last year, Johnston and Radloff, using FAO data, estimated that globally the harvested wood product pool provides a sink of 91 million metric tons of carbon. And interestingly, they estimate that that could grow to 120 million metric tons, but that growth depends on some assumptions about market conditions. And if we look at country level analyses, these are a little bit more difficult to compare, but there is evidence across a range of countries that carbon stored in sustainably sourced harvested wood products has or is contributing to emissions reductions. So this brings me to the one slide I promised on substitution benefits, and that's because this is the best example in our report of a direct comparison across studies and regions. And this describes the benefits, the climate benefits of using wood in construction. Across the top are the apartment buildings, and below that are buildings more generally. And if you look just at the top, you can see that across a range of studies, the average displacement factor is 3.62. That's written down through the middle of the slide there. And what that means is that for each ton of carbon in wood products used in place of some other product, in this example, steel or concrete, there occurs a greenhouse gas emission reduction of approximately 3.62 tons of carbon. So positive values indicate this climate benefit. And there's three things to note about this graph or table. Different studies produce different estimates, and I'm going to discuss why this is in the next set of slides. Even within a study, there is a range of estimates provided. These can describe the worst case, the expected case, and the best case scenarios. And that they're extremely variable. And we can see that even in the worst case scenario, and most of these are quite unlikely according to the authors, there's a climate benefit of using wood. So that gives us a very robust confidence in these results. And the third thing to note is that across multiple studies, multiple building types and locations conclude that there's this climate benefit of building with wood. So I want to talk about why the study results might disagree. There's a lot of insight to be gained from a better understanding of why they disagree. One thing to understand is that system boundaries may differ across studies. And system boundaries describe what's in and what's out of a particular analysis. So for example, is forest regrowth included or not? Is the eventual disposal of the material, either in the landfill or through energy recovery, included or not? What about transportation costs? What about the mix of the energy source? These details are often buried in the analysis or simply implied. They're quite difficult to unearth. So you need to be very careful about which aspects of the system are included or not included, because that can have a tremendous influence on the final estimation and our understanding of the analysis results. Another reason results might disagree is that they may be based on default conditions or on local information. So defaults exist because there's not adequate local information, and the local information that is missing would be variable over time and space or countries. So for example, we know that the carbon stored, that conversion factor, differs for, say, coniferous and non-coniferous woodage. And we can see that those proportions are shifting. How much is produced is shifting over time, and we know it's very variable by country and even within areas of a country. So studies using defaults will generally have different outcomes than studies using that local information of coniferous or non-coniferous wood. We also know that there's variability in decay rates or the half-lives that express how long carbon is stored by product. And these small differences, they might even be at the 100th level of a parameter that goes into a model. The small differences are multiplicative, and they can lead to very large differences in estimated outcomes. This is a challenge, but also an opportunity we're going to talk about. Now, units would be kind of funny if they weren't so painful, and as an American, I take full responsibility for one of the more painful situations in the world of units. When you read a paper and you see the word ton, you have to unearth what exactly is implied in terms of kilograms. And it's a little funny, yes, but it's also important to put it up here because I want to express the magnitude of the complication Something that should be simple really is not. And reports are included not just as quantities, but also as rates. They're reported as carbon, carbon dioxide, and as carbon equivalents, and across a variety of actual units. So now that we've looked across the studies, I want to spend the rest of our time talking about the most exciting part of the synthesis, which is, of course, the opportunities that we have. And I'm going to talk about 4 that our synthesis and exploration of the research has brought. The first is to look at data on recycling and the promotion of reuse of forest products. So on the graph to the left, we can see FAO data on the volume in million metric tons of recycled paper produced each year, and it is growing. So recycling effectively increases the time that carbon is stored in a product. And the length of time increased in paper by recycling, it might not seem long, it's certainly not on the order of decades, but there is a lot of paper in the world. And so small increases in storage time could have remarkable impacts. We don't know yet, this is why it's an opportunity for further work, but remarkable impacts on the total carbon mitigation benefit. And on the right is an announcement and a reminder that FAO is now producing new data for the first time ever on post-consumer recovered wood. The reuse of wood, just like recycling of paper, can increase the storage time in wood and in forest products, and in this case, probably for longer even than paper, and can magnify the climate change mitigation benefits. So as far as I know, there haven't been analyses quantifying and syntheses looking at the effects of recycling, this growing trend on the impact of forest products for climate mitigation. The second opportunity, I want to go back to those building scenarios that had a range of estimates, low, medium, and high. The second opportunity is to better isolate what we don't know. It can be also called quantifying our uncertainty. And uncertainty, it may be considered a bad word or terrible word, a word that indicates we're not sure, or worse yet, that discredits the results. And this is absolutely incorrect. Uncertainty is essential information, and better expressing it is really an opportunity. So if we think about our personal lives, biggest mistakes we might make come from what we failed to expect. We didn't realize something could happen, and we didn't prepare for it. We didn't realize we might be wrong, and we were overconfident. So a better way, I think, to look at uncertainty analysis is as an analysis that provides this essential information or worst case scenarios or ranges of possible outcomes. We saw in that building table of substitution factors how powerful it was to have those ranges. And knowing about this uncertainty can help us avoid risks. It can help us be prepared, avoid overconfidence. And through, for example, something called a value of information analysis, it can even help us isolate the most important pieces of missing information. So there's many ways of accomplishing uncertainty analysis. We could do Monte Carlo simulations just to provide confidence intervals, or formal sensitivity analyses that isolate the influence of particular inputs we're unsure about. And these kind of analysis can help us, for example, isolate and understand how the use of default half-lives on how long carbon's stored influences our understanding of the magnitude of the climate mitigation benefits. And it can help us identify where in the world we might find the largest mitigation benefits. And I'll point out that this isn't a fully new idea for me. This is also something that the IPCC has provided good practice guidance on. And that good practice guidance indicates we should be communicating uncertainty and providing confidence intervals, or estimates of uncertainty, when we provide our estimates of carbon storage. And this will help us to design more robust policies. And before I leave uncertainty, I just want to highlight that there can be really good news from uncertainty analysis. This is a photo from a small town outside of Rome, wood in a doorway that's clearly been stored for a very long time. So quantifying the range of possible outcomes can really help us learn from these extreme examples, including those best case scenarios. The third opportunity is to expand our analysis frameworks. So we really need analyses that can quantify the influence of emerging products, so cross-laminated timber, I-beams, glulam. And for that, we are going to need new data. And for that, we're going to need new international trade codes and then refinements of default values. So there's quite a bit of work to be done in order to quantify those climate change mitigation benefits of the emerging products, and a huge opportunity. We also need more information from tropical forests. As you may have noticed, many of the examples used were from temperate areas, and we are going to hear about new results from Costa Rica in just a minute, but there's a lot more work to be done there. We know that trees grow more quickly, and also that they decompose, or that the carbon, even in a forest product, might decompose more quickly. And I think there's also an opportunity to better account for wood energy. So carbon's not stored long, but the substitution benefits can be considerable, and these are not always adequately included even in some of the life cycle analysis that we reviewed. So finally, there's an enormous opportunity to bring together these disparate strands of knowledge that exist. And this goes beyond just summarizing what other people have done. To do this effectively, we have to manage for shifting system boundaries, control for the units and the defaults, and understand the sensitivities. We really need to understand why results disagree on the surface and whether that disagreement runs deeper. We need a common definition, for example, across studies of sustainable sourcing. And I think with a side-by-side comparison of results, we can then better refine and communicate what we're most sure of. We can figure out exactly what are the missing pieces, and we can isolate those conditions that maximize the full range of climate mitigation benefits of forest products. So this could even involve work in advance of analyses to ensure that the outcomes are comparable. And we'll hear about some syntheses with respect to substitution effects in the third presentation today. So I want to end with two slides that talk about actions. So what kinds of actions, in this case, within the sector, could support carbon storage benefits? So construction codes that make building with wood easier, improved and increased communication about the benefits of wood for climate change mitigation may be clear within the sector, but better communication outside of the sector. Wood certification programs to ensure sustainable forest management, and innovation at the end of life through reuse. And we now have data for that kind of innovation, for quantifying the effects of that kind of innovation. So that's really a win-win. And what kinds of positive actions globally can this knowledge support? So if we're producing all this information, we're synthesizing it, what do we hope people do? Of course, it can increase knowledge, can improve reporting on climate emissions and carbon emissions. What gets measured gets done, right? So accurate reporting is essential. And I know that not all benefits, in particular substitution benefits, are reported in the land use, land cover change, and forestry sector. So it will take a little innovation to communicate the full range of benefits from harvested wood products. When we have better information and communication of that information, it can support changing consumer behavior. We can influence decisions from individuals to corporations and what they buy. This kind of information can change the way we build, and it can increase and enhance the sustainable management of our global forest resources. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I want to turn it back to Heidi, who can introduce the next speaker, and I'll be happy to answer questions at the end of all the three speakers. Thank you very much.
Ashley, thank you so much. That was just, that was remarkable, very informative. Really appreciate your excellent work in this area. Before I introduce our next panelist, I do want to mention, put your questions in the chat feature. We will be taking questions at the end, and I see there's some good dialogue already underway there. So if you can, as you're thinking of things, please put your questions there. But now let me turn things over to Federico Alice. He is a forest engineer specializing in carbon management, mostly for the agriculture, forestry, and land use sector. His most recent work involved the inventory of carbon in wood products and a life cycle assessment of wood production from natural tropical forests. Federico is currently a professor at the School of Environmental Sciences from the National University of Costa Rica. He is going to present on tropical forest management and the life cycle of wood from tropical forests. Let me just also, and with that, let me just welcome Federico. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for joining the presentation. So yeah, as it has been said, today I want to discuss the potential benefits of forest management to mitigate climate change. I focus my analysis on tropical forests, as well. Many tropical countries are in the process of designing and implementing their REDD+ strategies. And in this process, forest management is usually excluded. It is not clearly included, or it is completely missing. And I believe that this is partly due to the dichotomy that exists between logging and conservation. So we are confronted with a climate crisis, and we know that among the most cost-efficient ways to mitigate climate change is reducing deforestation and increasing forest cover. But as obvious as this may sound, increasing forest cover is faced with multiple challenges, among which the most important probably is the competition with other land uses, specifically agriculture. So here I'll be talking about a Costa Rican case study. This was a project that was jointly done between Wageningen University and the National University of Costa Rica on the life cycle of wood from tropical forests. This is a relevant case study as Costa Rica has undergone through all stages of the forest transition curve. That is, back in 1940, we had a 75% forest cover, which we were very successful to deforestate, reaching a 21% in 1987, when finally deforestation stabilized, and we managed also successfully to increase forest cover through conservation policies. These policies, the landmark of these policies was the most recent forestry law that included the first nationwide payment for environmental services and a ban on land use change. Since then, forest cover has continued to increase. However, we see that since 2005 approximately, this increase in forest cover has been only marginal, or in some cases, it has completely stopped. And this shows that this approach to conservation based on a payment scheme for environmental services has not been able to fully overcome the barriers of this competition, the competition between forest and other land uses. Since forest products are forest management is a potentially additional source of income for landowners. So then we look into the evolution of wood production and use in Costa Rica. As you can see there in the graph, sawnwood production, the source of sawnwood production has been changing over the years. That is, in 1990.
Federico?
Sorry.
Yes?
Yes. Can you put on your PowerPoint? It is not on the screen. So you need to share your screen first, please.
Yeah.
Here we are. Just make it on the presentation mode and then it's fine. Okay, great.
Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry. This is, well, anyway. So where were we? Wood production in Costa Rica. So here we see that wood production has been changing over the years. In 1990, most of the wood production was coming from natural forests. And now this has changed. And until now, by the end of the analyzed period, wood production from natural forests is only 5%. And coincidentally, the most dramatic change in the sourcing of wood from forests happened immediately after this forestry law in 1997. So although, and I need to be clear, although this forestry law did not include any restriction on forest management, just immediately after there were stricter regulations and disincentives. And the sourcing of wood was not the only thing that changed during this period. We also changed the way we used wood. So back in 1990, 73% of all the wood harvested, of domestic harvest, was used in construction. While now, construction represents only 26%. The country has shifted from wood sourced from natural forests and used in construction to wood sourced from plantations and used in short-term applications such as packaging. So, although we cannot completely attribute these changes to these conservation policies, they are strongly correlated. And I believe this is also partly due to the idea that harvesting tropical forests have a negative impact on the environment and that oppose the goals of conservation, that is to maintain and increase forest cover. in order to investigate if effectively logging leads to a higher environmental impact, we perform a life cycle assessment of wood from tropical forests. In this life cycle assessment, we begin at the forest where we know it will absorb CO2, and that if forests had the ability to store, to grow indefinitely, the best conservation or the best mitigation policy would be the conservation of forests. But we know this is not the case, and that there are limits to how much carbon can be stored in forests. This can range from 100 tons per hectare to several hundred tons per hectare. Forests are found in a state of dynamic equilibrium. That is, that there are constant carbon gains and carbon losses. This can also be affected by large-scale carbon losses that due to natural disturbances, but as long as given the time, these forests will recover. Similarly, when we talk about logging, it can be seen as a large-scale disturbance. Selective logging, as it is usually performed in the tropics, is a system by which only a few trees are extracted by hectare, with harvest intensities that can range from 10 cubic meters per hectare to 30 cubic meters per hectare. And of course, in the process, it will cause a damage to the ecosystem. There are going to be biomass losses, mainly, well, aside from the wood that is harvested from the forest, there will be biomass losses due to the felling of trees and the infrastructure that is required to extract this wood. If we account for all these biomass losses as emissions, we come to the conclusion that the system is carbon positive. That is, that the outflow is larger than the inflow. And just to clarify, we talk about carbon positive because we use the atmosphere as the reference. So this means that there is going to be an increase in atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations. This obviously means more climate change, and this carbon positive result is actually negative. When this has been done, this has led to the idea that logging necessarily leads to the degradation of forests, and that this degradation is on the same scale as the emissions that result from deforestation. In our life cycle assessment, what we ask is, what if we extend this time frame? What if we extend what happens to this forest to a period that coincides with a logging cycle? Logging cycles in tropical forests, they can range from 15 to 60 years, and this will depend on the intensity of the harvest, on site conditions, of course, and in some cases, local regulations. And they determine the period that is needed for that forest to recover after harvesting. So once we consider this time frame, now we allow the forest to regrow. And this regrow, if it's enough, it will determine the sustainability of the system. If there is enough carbon input to offset the carbon emissions, then we would say that the system is carbon neutral. But as has been discussed earlier, this is not the only thing that happens during this logging cycle. Now, what initially was considered as an emission, that is, the carbon that has been harvested, or the wood that has been harvested from this forest, will accumulate as harvested wood products, in products in use. This can vary, as has been shown, from some months to hundreds of years, and it depends on how we use wood. Also, if we use wood as an energy source, that would mean an immediate loss of carbon. This is a stock that globally is known to be growing, and that it can offset emissions of around 1% of global greenhouse gases annually. But that's not the only thing that happens to wood products. Since once wood products are retired from service, they will also flow into their end of life, and they can face different end of life options that can be from the recycling to the combustion or incineration of wood with or without energy recovery, or different forms of end of life in solid waste disposal sites. That can be from open dumps to landfills, which is usually the most common end of life option in the tropics. Landfills or solid waste disposal sites are also known to be a very important carbon reservoir. And in those cases, when they have been included in inventories of harvested wood products, they can even be larger than the stock of carbon in products in use. The mechanisms that lead to this long-term storage, that is the anaerobic conditions found in landfills, are fairly known. Also, how this is partly offset, this long-term storage, by methane emissions that also occur due to these anaerobic conditions. But all in all, if we consider that there's going to be forest regrowth and emissions along the life cycle, but that some of the carbon might end up stored in products or in landfills, we can also come to the conclusion that the result might be carbon negative. That is, that the inflow of carbon into the system is larger than the outflow. And this is mainly due to carbon storage in wood products. Challenging this conclusion of a carbon negative result, well, is the fact that, well, for once, the methane emissions from during the end of life might be able to offset some of the storage, given that they have a higher global warming potential. And also that we need to include in the analysis all the inputs from fossil sources that are needed to harvest, transport, and transform wood into products, and also during their use. Once we include all of these processes within our framework, then we wonder, okay, so is the result going to be carbon positive, carbon negative, or carbon neutral? Now, going to our results, we found that in Costa Rica, to harvest an average hectare of forest, of tropical forest, emissions from fossil sources are relatively negligible. There's 1.45 megagrams or tons of CO2 that are emitted due to these activities, and they represent between 6 to 7% of the whole life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. And this result is consistent to those found elsewhere, specifically in Canada, where they have used similar system boundaries, that is a rotation period, and including all possible sources of emissions, that is from biomass and from fossil sources. If we look only into the biomass, into the balance of carbon into the life cycle of products, we find that on average, from a hectare of forest, there are 10 tons of CO2 stored in wood products. And in order to harvest those 10 tons, we emitted around 15 tons. Emissions happening at the forest are the largest. So roughly, you require 1.5 tons to harvest 1 ton of CO2, which during the use phase, those 10.6 tons, around 2 tons will be emitted during the use phase. This is mostly due to the combustion of biomass for energy purposes. That can be from fuel wood, traditional fuel wood, to other sources, such as pellets. Finally, during the end of life, and this includes not just emissions from landfills, but also from all those residues that happen during the transformation of wood along its life cycle, emissions are around 4 megagrams of CO2, and they represent 18% of total life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. During that same period, as I mentioned earlier, we left the forest to recover, and we estimate that it was fully able to recover that lost biomass. That means that all in all, and considering that there is still carbon stored in the forest, in products, and in landfill, result for our Costa Rican case study shows that the balance is negative. There is still carbon holding the system during the analyzed period, avoiding emissions to the atmosphere. When we look at our confidence interval, we notice first, this -13, that the possibilities for this negative outcome, which is holding carbon in the system, is higher than those that lead to emissions. We know that those emissions will happen mostly to how we manage our forest. And like Ashley mentioned earlier, we need to be more clear about how we interpret uncertainty, and hopefully to help us doing this. So I provided this graph that shows how this uncertainty is being distributed. Here, the green shaded area shows the results from our analysis. And as you can see, so the -13 and the 10, they represent very extreme values. They're extreme and improbable results, while most of our results are concentrated on the negative side, representing that the system is able to hold that carbon and avoid some emissions. To test this result even further, we performed another analysis where we extended the time frame of the analysis. We did this for 100 years. Given that it is said that in order for carbon storage to be enough to have an effect on atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations, it has to be avoided for at least this period. That is the red shaded area shown in this graph. Then we see that the possibilities of a negative or a positive outcome become evenly distributed. But in this case, in the case of a tropical forest, we wonder if this is accurate. That is, given that during that 100 period, there's going to be more than just one logging cycle. There can be several logging cycles. So this result doesn't really reflect the reality of a hectare of forest. Finally, to test the effect of how wood is allocated, we changed the global warming potential from 100 years, which is the most common global warming potential and the one we are all used to. We change it to a global potential of 20 years. And this is to give a bit more weight to short-lived greenhouse gases such as methane. And this would show, or at least in the case of Costa Rica, how this allocation into short-term products, like higher allocations into short-term products, will have an effect on the final result. We see here the orange shaded area that results are still mostly on the negative side, but now the tail towards the positive result becomes a bit more pronounced. And this is basically because there is a larger allocation into short-term products, leads to a higher storage in landfills, but also higher emissions during the end of life. Oh, but despite this, in considering all other results, we are fairly confident of the potential climate mitigation through tropical forest management and wood use. We confirm that logging tropical forests does not lead to degradation so long as forests are managed sustainably, and that for this sustainable management to happen, reduced impact logging remains the main mitigation measure. Forests are the main source of emissions during logging, and it is up to how we perform these harvesting practices to reduce this impact. Finally, we can conclude that wood production and forest conservation should be complementary, as they do not have competing views. And just to clarify also, the evidence shows that for every forest for which there has been a management plan, it remains as forest. So it is not threatened by deforestation. Finally, to increase even more our confidence on our results, I discussed before how the country has been shifting its production from natural forests to forest plantations. And that, as a result, we also change how we use products from construction to packaging, from long-term products to short-term products. What I did not mention was during this period, during this 30-year period, that construction sector did not stop growing, and that as a result, it has done so at the expense of substitute products that, as has been described, have a higher carbon footprint. So inadvertently, through conservation policies, through policies that were aimed exclusively at the conservation of forest, we might have caused an environmental impact that was unexpected and that until now remains unaccounted. In order to learn more about this substitution effect, the next speaker will talk about it. Thank you very much. And I give the floor back to Heidi.
Thank you so much for that, Federico. Really appreciate your insights. Again, great conversation happening in the chat. So after our next presentation, we will turn to at least a couple of questions, I'm hoping. And so just continue to put those questions there. So now let me turn things over to our next presenter, Dr. Hans Verkerk. He is the principal scientist on climate smart forestry at the European Forest Institute in Finland. He obtained his PhD with distinction from the University of Eastern Finland and has been involved in studies on European forest resource assessments, woody biomass availability, forest ecosystem services, and climate impacts and mitigation. His presentation, Forest Renewables, Replacing Fossil-Based and Greenhouse Gas Intensive Products, will look at possible action for substitution, contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals. Hans, welcome. It's great to have you with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Heidi, for the kind words to introduce me, and also for giving me the opportunity to present the results or our project that we have been carrying out. So the title of my presentation is Forest Renewables, Replacing Fossil-Based and Greenhouse Gas Intensive Products, and this reflects the project title that we are carrying out for FAO and its ACSFI committee. So I'm presenting myself, but also, of course, on behalf of colleagues that have been involved, particularly Mariana Hasegawa, with whom I've been working closely on this project. As already highlighted by some of the previous speakers, there's an urgent need to decrease greenhouse gas emissions. So in 2015, 195 countries developed the Paris Agreement, in which they agreed to stop or halt the increase of global temperature by 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels, and preferably below 1.5 degrees. A lot of actions have been designed and partially implemented, and when we look at those policies that have been planned, there is still a large gap of between where we will likely be and where we need to be. So there's still a gap between the plans and what needs to be done. So this highlights an urgent need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to remove carbon or CO2 from the atmosphere. And forestry in this context is key. Forests store carbon in biomass and soil and in wood products. And if you use wood products, you can substitute for more energy and emission intensive materials such as steel, concrete and glass. So within this context of substitution, we are working on the Foresight project for FAO and its ACSFI committee. And the main objectives of our project are to understand the environmental, social, economic benefits of substitution, with the focus on environmental benefits. We are looking at the role of forest products looking at the role that forest products may play in a growing or emerging bioeconomy, and we will provide insight in the supply and demand dynamics of forest product sector. We are still working on the project, and it's to be completed by the end of this year. So so far this presentation will be more like a teaser in which I will present only part of the results. So in this presentation, I'll be particularly looking into the review or presenting a review of the existing scientific knowledge of substitution effects of wood-based products with a focus on climate aspects. So we'll be looking at what are substitution factors, what are the estimates available either at the product or at the market level, but we also shortly touch on other environmental impacts related to substitution. We will build on a database that has been developed earlier by EFI. So there's a report published 2 years ago by my colleague Pekka Leskinen and others. And we have used that report as a starting point in the project and also updated it with more recent estimates. So if you are very keen on wanting to know what we have been working on, you can have a look at this report as a start, and then you have to wait a little bit longer for the report to be developed for FAO. Just as a reminder, I think this was also shortly introduced already by Ashley in her presentation. So forests play a key role in the global carbon cycle. Forests remove CO2 from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, and the carbon is then stored in biomass. Some trees die, branches break off, and leaves drop, and so part of the carbon is also moved to soils. So there's also soil carbon storage taking place. And then when trees are harvested, part of the carbon is also removed to wood products, and also wood products are then acting as a storage. At the same time, wood products can also substitute for other materials, such as, for example, concrete or glass or steel, which are typically considered to have to be associated with more emissions during the production, use and disposal of these products. So broadly, you can look at sequestration, so at carbon storage in biomass, soil and products, and at substitution. And in this presentation, I'm looking particularly into the substitution part with the focus on products and not on energy. Life cycle assessments are key. So it's a key methodology that has been highlighted also by Ashley in her presentation and also by Federico in his presentation, as it provides, it can be used to provide input, insights in emissions that occur along the life cycle of a product. An LCA study alone is not enough. So to estimate substitution effect, so we also need to compare it with another product. So substitution can be estimated by quantifying and comparing the emissions over the life cycle of a product made from wood versus of a functionally equivalent product made from other materials than wood. There's currently no fixed or prescribed way on how substitution factor should be calculated. So there's a range of methodologies used in the literature, but one that is commonly applied is that one looks at the emissions that occur of the non-wood product. You subtract the emissions that occur in the development of the wood product, and you divide by the amount of wood that is included in the product. If you have a positive value, it means that you have benefits with regards to climate change mitigation. If it's a negative value, it gives it worsens the climate. So we have conducted a structured review of the scientific literature, and we tried to extract all estimates that we could find of possible substitution effects. And I would like to note here that we studies are typically reporting them in different units. And so on. So we have been trying to harmonize these as much as possible, but I would like to highlight that we have excluded the carbon storage effect in forest biomass, soil and wood products from these estimates. There's few studies that include this as well, but we have excluded it to make the results more comparable from all the studies that we have found in the literature. So when we conducted the review, we identified 64 studies that provide information on the substitution factors, and from these studies we extracted almost 500 unique substitution factors. So this is an increase compared to what was published before by Leskinen et al., as we have identified additional studies and also more recent literature again. So when we look at the studies that are available, we see that there's a lot of information on substitution factors from the United States and Canada, as well as the Nordic countries within Europe, so particularly for Finland, Sweden, and Norway. We do find some studies in other parts of the world, for example, in Asia for China and Japan. We have some studies for New Zealand and Australia. We have few studies identified for South America, for example, Brazil, but we did not find any studies yet for Africa. So this highlights that the results that we have and the findings that will be mainly based on situations in US, Canada, and the Nordic countries. When we look at these studies, they are also very different in their setup. So all the studies, they include the emissions or substitution effects that occur during the production or manufacturing of a product. Many, but not all, include also what happens at the end of the life of a product. So at the disposal phase, so is it recycled or is it incinerated? Very few studies have looked at substitution effects of the use phase, and hardly anything looks at cascading effects. So then when we look at the substitution values or factors that we have identified, we see many of the factors are found for the construction sector. So almost 3/4 are either for structural construction or non-structural. With structural, we mean buildings, beams, walls, wood frames, and with non-structural, we are referring to, for example, windows, window frames, doors, and cladding, and other materials. So we see a dominance in the substitution factors that we find for the construction sector. We find a few for furniture and for packaging, but for example, we see very few factors being published for paper products, which is a well-established product, as well as for chemicals and some other product categories. Associated with that, we see most of the materials that are being substituted relate to cement, concrete, ceramics, or stone, or metals and alloy. And this, of course, also reflects the dominance, the predominance of the substitution factors related to construction, because these are common materials used for those purposes. We also see some substitution for plastics, and for combinations of different materials, for example, steel together with concrete, being compared to a wood product. When we then look at all the substitution values that we find in the literature, over 90% of all the values that we find are positive values, meaning that wood products provide benefits with regard to climate change mitigation over the use of non-wood functionally equivalent products. Here in the table, you see the values that we found on average for different product categories, but you also see the large range that we find for the different values. So these ranges, they are very much dependent on the type of product that is exactly being considered, the non-wood material that is being substituted, the production technology that has been used, the number of life cycles that have been considered, and as well as assumptions on what happens at the end of the life of a particular product. So we see quite a large variability in the values that we find. So overall, you can see the values here in the table. These are based on comparisons at the product level, but when you want to look at mitigation potentials or climate benefits, you also have to look at to what extent these products are actually being used or produced. So you need to combine it with information on their production. So here, this is an example that we have used, produced in the study in 2018. Where we look at the substitution effects of the different products and also at the production levels of a particular product categories. So for we see coniferous sawnwood as an important product that could be providing substitution benefits, because quite a large amount of the wood is used for that purpose, and it has also a moderately high substitution effect. For textiles or man-made cellulose fibers, we see a larger substitution factor, but the volumes are still quite small, at least in the case of Europe. So the overall benefits might be a bit smaller at this moment. A lot of wood is also used for printing and writing paper, as well as for packaging, but we have quite few estimates available on what are the substitution benefits provided by these products. So there it's quite hard to say what are the total substitution benefits given. There are some studies that have attempted this, but it is generally quite hard to do, because you need to know what kind of product is being produced, so the wood product, but also which product is being replaced in reality. So these studies are quite hard to find. So we have identified a few studies that provided such overviews for different parts of the world. Perhaps I could highlight the study also for Finland that was published. So they estimated a substitution factor of 1.13 kilograms of carbon per kilograms of carbon in the wood product. Interestingly, the study found that this substitution factor is not enough to compensate for reductions in carbon storage in biomass when you increase harvest levels. So the study made a comparison, what happens if we would increase harvest levels, and what is the substitution factor that is needed to compensate for this. And it would be roughly double the amount compared to what the average substitution factor that is calculated for the Finnish industry. This also highlights again the point that I tried to make earlier, that it's important to look not only at maximizing substitution, but you need to look at what happens in the forest, what happens with carbon storage in the product, and what happens through substitution effects. Then I would also like to highlight there's other environmental effects to be considered. Biodiversity impacts is quite often an impact to be considered, but there's also, of course, during the manufacturing of different products, there might also emissions occur of other pollutants. And LCA studies typically consider a range of different impact categories, which include also the eutrophication, the acidification, and human toxicity. There are some studies that could be used to estimate substitution benefits or effects by wood products for these impact categories, but the understanding is currently quite limited. There's one review study published in 2012 that looked at what are the substitution effect by bio-based products. So this was not only products made from wood, but also products from other types of biomass, either from agriculture or I think also aquatic biomass. And they also looked at all the impacts, and they made a comparison, and they found that bio-based product might exert higher environmental impacts than conventional counterparts with regards to eutrophication and ozone depletion. But this, I think these impacts are still not well understood. So also substitution relates to these kind of issues, but the understanding on these needs to be improved. So then coming a little bit to the end of my presentation. So what would be the key messages that I would like to share with you? Overall, we find that wood or wood-based products provide climate benefits or benefits to the climate due to lower emissions that occur during the manufacturing, use and disposal of the product compared to non-wood products. So over 90% of all the values that we found were positive. But we should not only look at what happens through substitution. So it's important to have a holistic approach where we also look at what happens in the forest, what happens with carbon storage in products, disturbances that may affect the system, and as well as potential leakage effects. Third, there is still a lack of knowledge on climate impacts of existing and emerging forest products. We see literature is dominated, the literature of substitution effects is dominated by construction materials, but we see for conventional or existing products few estimates for paper, and especially for emerging or novel wood-based products such as textiles, packaging, and chemicals. To improve the understanding of substitution effects needs to be improved. In the end, we think that it's not the aim to maximize the substitution factor only, but it's also very much important to look at resource efficiency so that we produce the products more efficiently. We better consider recycling, because these also have impacts on carbon emissions that occur, especially then during the end of life, but sometimes also during the production of products. There's also a need for better understanding of future developments. So substitution factors are not fixed or constant over time. They are affected by technological development. So the technology by which forest products are produced, these technologies improve, but so the same happens also with the other products to which they are compared. The uses of different products may change. So if you want to look at the overall impacts of the substitution or substitution benefits, you also need to look at what are the product mixes that are considered in the future, as well as energy supply. So quite often assumptions are made on the energy that is substituted through at the end of the life, but these energy mixes are also changing over time. So a better understanding of future developments are needed to understand the effects of substitution. And finally, we think it's important to look at all impacts that occur with the use of wood, as well as other products. So it should not be limited to climate-related impacts, but all environmental or even socio-economical and environmental impacts. And with this, I would like to end the presentation, and I would like to hand over again to Heidi.
Thank you so much, Hans. Really appreciate your insights. We're going to take just a few minutes for questions. There's been a terrific amount of engagement in the chat feature. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but first for Ashley, I had a quick question for Ashley. You mentioned the need to include the substitution effect into climate change reporting, and wondering how this reflects on the IPCC's recommendation from the outset that's not yet been implemented. But if you could quickly comment on that, and then I've got a question for each of our panelists.
Absolutely. When I'm not in a position to comment on what the IPCC would think, I was intending to imply that as a sector, we need to communicate all of the areas where reporting includes benefits from forest. And that includes reporting that is not just in the LUCF sector, but also reporting in other sectors where the substitution benefits are accrued. Hope that clarifies it.
Great, thank you so much. So for each of our panelists, you're each residing in a different part of the world. There is a lot of policy activity in this space as policymakers increasingly recognize the opportunity to store carbon in our forests. So I'm interested if you could give us a piece of counsel. If you were to give counsel to these policymakers, what would you encourage them to watch out for or encourage as they're considering policy development? Hans, I wonder if I could start with you.
Yeah, I think it was also in my presentation. I think they should look at what happens in the forest, what happens in the products and through substitution. I think you should not look at any of these items individually. So also to the previous point highlighted by Ashley, if you look just what happens in the LULUCF sector, I think you get an incomplete picture of all the things, all the benefits that forest could provide. So move beyond the sectoral view. I think this is the key point. I could list probably some more, but.
Great, thanks. Thank you so much, Hans. Ashley?
I think similar advice in that I would say not to focus really on one study or one result, but to look at the collection of research that we have available, because as I mentioned, each study or each project has its own system boundaries, and these can really influence the results. So the policymakers need to understand the system boundaries of the result that they're basing their policy on, and perhaps look across a spectrum of results, these kinds of synthesis like what Hans has just provided, so that we see the range of possible outcomes. I think that's very important, especially in these high stakes decision making like this.
Federico, what else would you add here?
Yeah, thank you. Like, well, in the case of tropical forests, like I started my presentation, there is this divide between how we perceive logging and how it has been included in conservation policies, I think. And this is the nice what a life cycle assessment adds to this discussion, because it suddenly shows all these indirect effects that can happen due to one of these policies. In this case, the fact that this idea of logging leading to a negative environmental impact was not necessarily the case. So I basically call for this reconsideration. Also, if you focus only on conservation, and such as in Costa Rica, focus in schemes that only recognize environmental services, you're missing out on very important opportunities far beyond just climate mitigation. And in this regard, I've been wondering how to include this, and I wonder what happened to certification systems when we are developing REDD+ strategies, and logging is not really included in these strategies. I wonder if existing forest certification systems aren't a good way of including forest management, and also as a way to monitor and report and verify that the effects from logging are effectively done under a sustainable management system. So that would be my recommendation, and kind of also, yeah, change this view, basically, this view of logging leading necessarily to a negative effect.
Enrico, thank you. Thank you to each of our panelists. So before you all leave, I did want to introduce Andrew Large, who's going to close out our conversation today. My colleague Andrew is the Director General of the Confederation of Paper Industries in the United Kingdom. Andrew has served in this role since 2016 and has had several leadership roles in trade associations covering the construction, industrial cleaning, and food industries. So Andrew, it's been quite a conversation this morning from around the world. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Heidi. And first of all, I'd really like to thank our speakers, Jose, Ashley, Federico, and Hans, for their contributions today. I'd like to thank Heidi for her splendid moderation, and also the FAO team for their smooth organization of today's webinar. So Sven, Lyndall, Ashley, and Francesca. And I'd really like to compliment the speakers on their insightful presentations. These are important contributions to the work of ACSFI and the commitment of the forest industries in the fight against climate change. And I guess I'd like to highlight 4 key takeaways and then add one issue to the discussion. I think the first takeaway is the scale of the positive contribution that sustainable forest management and forest products can make to mitigating climate change. But together with that, my second takeaway would be the importance of quality data. If we're going to persuade people of the benefits of sustainable forest management and forest products, then we need to be able to demonstrate that with evidence. I was also very struck by the multiple and simultaneous uses of forests and why that's important for the work with regards to climate change. We cannot start parceling up land so that this land is sacrosanct for climate purposes, this land is sacrosanct for harvesting, this land is sacrosanct for biodiversity, and so on. We must, if we're to maximize the use of the forests, we must make sure that the uses are both multiple and simultaneous for the future. And I would also add that I think it's important that we retain our focus on emissions reduction overall. As I think Hans absolutely showed in his presentation, we need to focus on the reduction of emissions every bit as much as we need to focus on the substitution of or removal of emissions that have been created by other industries or other sectors. And I would add my own view that we need a clear global framework for policymakers so that we can realize this potential across all countries. And I absolutely see the role for ACSFI in delivering that clear global framework. Indeed, recently ACSFI agreed its strategic goal for the 2020 to 2030 process. And that goal is, over the next decade, ACSFI will advise FAO in its work towards the achievement of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and seek to enhance FAO's impact by catalyzing innovative forest-related actions through partnerships between FAO, the private sector, and other stakeholders. And I think that today's webinar is absolutely a key action driving the fulfillment of that strategic goal. And I guess I'd like to conclude just by highlighting two of the UN Sustainable Development Goals that we particularly focused on today, which is Goal 12 and Goal 13. So sustainable consumption and production and climate action, and to highlight the forest products industry as an industry whose achievement of Goal 12 will drive the achievement of Goal 13. We are a sustainable industry with our sustainable consumption and production, and in acting in that way, we will drive the achievement of Goal 13, which is climate action and the reduction of climate change. Also, we have the UN Global Forest Goals. Sustainable forest management appears in Goal 1, but also in Goals 3, 4, and 5. So that's hugely important for the UN's overall direction with regard to forests. And again, ACSFI plays a key role in that. Global Forest Goal 2 covers the economic, social, and environmental benefits of forestry, and that absolutely ties in with UN Sustainable Development Goal 12 on sustainable consumption and production. And again, the presentations that we've heard today absolutely build on the contribution of ACSFI to that agenda. And finally, Global Forest Goal 6 is all about the collaboration, coordination, and coherence between the United Nations and stakeholders on all of these global forest issues. And I think, to come full circle, ACSFI is the embodiment of Global Forest Goal 6. It is that point at which industry, United Nations gets together and has the discussion about improving the sustainability of forestry. And so, as my last remark, I'd like to add my thanks to all the attendees of today's webinar for their involvement and their commitment to this work. And to conclude, I would like to hand back over to Heidi, who I know is going to wrap up things for today. So thank you.
Andrew, thank you so much. And once again, thank you to my colleague earlier, Jose Carlos, for opening the session, Sven and the terrific team at FAO for your work. Also want to thank our outstanding panel of Ashley, Federico, and Hans. I want to thank everybody who joined us today. We had a tremendous participation rate. Again, this will be recorded. Presentations will be on the website. Thank you to our team at FAO. And with that, I'll just thank everyone again for spending time on this very important conversation this morning. Please stay well, stay healthy, safe, and have a great day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.